Well, maybe first of all, I should say that there is no such thing as history. History does not exist. There is no such thing as history, there's only historians. You cannot visit history, you can't go there and prove anything or disprove anything. And the witnesses of history are subjective opinions about textual writing historians. Remarkably, which I always find rather strange and unhappy, is the fact that most of our attitudes towards history are not about images, they're about text. There are hundreds and thousands of historians all over the world in every language giving you their opinion. So history's only an opinion. There's nothing to prove. You might say there are documents, and are the documents truthful? But again, you know that most historians are liars. Georgian history of notions of the Soviet Union are rather different from those in Italy and America, and certainly in the UK. There is a feeling, isn't there, that, from Julius Caesar to Winston Churchill, they might be very good writers, but they're not telling you the truth. They're making vested interest. Julius Caesar wanted to prove he was a great general, so all the victories are put together in such a way as to support him. And Winston Churchill, who's a very engaging leader, of course, and certainly a good writer, again, is talking about himself. One of the greatest works, I think, in the English literature in the UK is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. It's a big classic consideration, apparently, of the decline and fall, indeed, of the Roman Empire. But really, it's not about the Roman Empire at all. It's about the British Empire. So all history is written with a vested interest, and you cannot believe it. I sincerely believe you cannot believe it. I think it's entertaining to read, and I read a huge amount of history and I'm fascinated by it, but I don't for a moment believe it. It's all a convention that we organize to support our comfort zone. And I think also, that we could say that maybe history is only a branch of literature. I think in the 19th century, certainly in the English context, everybody learnt their history from the English novel, Walter Scott, for example. And now I suppose everybody learns their history from the cinema, Ridley Scott, Walter Scott to Ridley Scott. But again, that's all the support of the notion, indeed, that history is only a branch of literature. So that's my sort of opening statement in answer to your question. So don't let's believe that there's anything called reality. There isn't. And cinema certainly doesn't purvey it. And I don't really believe there's any such thing as a historical truth. So the field is open. And I can be as valuable or as non-valuable as anybody else. I have been studying Eisenstein, I think, ever since I was an art student in London in the 1950s. And not particularly because I ever wanted to make a film. I think, I was 21 in 1963, and I had no idea then that I was ever going to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a painter. I still want to be a painter. Painters are far more valuable than filmmakers. But I suppose I've been to everywhere in the world that Eisenstein has been to. Been all over Russia. I've certainly been to Georgia and certainly been to countries even further east where he was in exile in the Second World War. And I've been to all the countries he's been to in Europe and certainly in North America and South America and indeed in Mexico. And I think I've read practically everything in translation that he's ever written. So I won't say, I'm a number one authority, but I know a lot about him. And then I think probably about 10 years ago, I began to consider the possibility of considering creators, artists who were counter-revolutionary, who were related to the notion of the outsider. I think a successful artist always has to be an outsider. He, I think, is given the license to be irritating, to be provocative, to try and give an alternative vision, away from the status quo. I live in Holland, I live in Amsterdam, and right outside my window is the big museum of Dutch art, which is called the Rijksmuseum, and in it is a whole series of Rembrandt paintings. I became involved, I think, around about 2006, in really seriously considering Rembrandt as an outsider, as a cultural icon, and I started making films and exhibitions about him. So that was the first one. I'd always somehow thought that maybe making films about filmmakers was a bit incestuous, too close, too much about what I was doing. But then I realized it could be a way for me to learn, not only about what I was doing, but myself as well. Then I made a film about a man called Goltzius, who was a Dutch printmaker. And the repetition of printmaking is a bit like the repetition of filmmaking. So there was an identity between the notion of an engraver and the notion of a filmmaker. And then I started going to Mexico quite frequently, and I went to this town called Guanajuato. I went there, had retrospectives, did a lot of talking, showed films, etc. And when I was there, I realized that it might be fascinating to make a documentary film about Que Viva Mexico, which was the unfinished film that Eisenstein tried to make there in 1931. But I became more and more intrigued by the place and the man and the historical situation. The fact that Mexico had had a big revolution 10 years before the storming of the Winter Palace, so there was a precedent there. And I started writing dialogue from Eisenstein's point of view, and I realized that probably it might be more entertaining, considering my first statement to you, there's no such thing as the truth, to be able to make a subjective documentary about the failure of Que Viva Mexico. And we've ended up with a film. But you can see the origins of the film are still there. There's a lot of documentary footage, the determination to keep telling you, instructing you, and telling audiences about history. So this examination of notions of historical truth. And the whole film, I think, is full of is full of homilies and anecdotes and list making and references and cinematic arguments. They discuss, for example, about fucking and dying in the cinema. Why is it important and why do we keep doing it? And there are a list of heroes who've died. And here's, there's a long list of the dead. And there's a lot of self-reflexive information, like Eisenstein thinks, like I do, that cinema won't last, that cinema will disappear. I believe it will disappear very, very quickly now. He says that nobody will remember filmmakers, that they certainly will remember painters. So the whole film is full of layers and layers of meaning and referencing and so on and so on. And concerns for film language. The medium is the message. It's a great Apollonian use of symmetry, left-hand side, right-hand side, big architectural explanations. And did you realize the whole film is symmetrical in time? The first scene of the film is exactly like the last scene of the film. The second from the beginning is like the second from the last. The third from the beginning is like the third from the last, till you come exactly in the middle of the film, which is the Soviet flag being shoved up the anus of the protagonist, which is a multi metaphorical meaning. It's meaning two fingers to the notions of the Russian Revolution. It's explaining, I suppose, Eisenstein's irony about the situation. It's also central, of course, to homosexual activity. And it's meant on lots of different levels. But I don't think our memories aren't very good at remembering time, so this thing has to be pointed out to you. And the whole film is a quotation. It's a series of quotations, quotations, quotations. So I think, we've made in Eisenstein in Guanajuato a very multi-layered film, which is much about a film about a film. It's about a film, it's about cinema, and it uses the digital revolution, a new vocabulary. You probably can guess if you don't know. It was not very popular in Russia. The Russians had nothing to do with the film. There's no Russian money, there's no Russian film. Eisenstein is an international figure, and we found the footage in Mexico and California of French Cinematheque, and we found it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But I was encouraged by the performance of the actor to make two more films. So we're going to make two more films about Eisenstein. One is about Eisenstein here in Switzerland. Just up the road is a place called La Sarraz, which Eisenstein visited, and made a film called Storm over La Sarraz, which is about an allegory of cinema, that old story, that old question, is cinema entertainment or is it art, which we still all constantly talk about. Then the whole reason, I suppose, for Eisenstein to go to Mexico, he'd just been in Hollywood for 11 months. So our second film in a trilogy will simply be called Eisenstein in Hollywood. So we'll make an examination of what happened to him there. I believe, Eisenstein certainly is probably the greatest filmmaker that cinema has ever known. I don't think that's saying very much because cinema is very, very young. It's only 120 years old. It's still an embryo, still hasn't begun yet. I do believe the digital revolution has created amazing possibilities. You know, the cinema of the world can be disseminated now on my smartphone, which is much more satisfactory. And we know that cinema is dying very, very quickly now. Everybody's interested in social media. Very few people see movies on big screens, which are louder and noisier and bigger than you are. Perhaps the only place you can do this now is in film festivals. Variety magazine, which you must know is the Hollywood magazine, said that only 5% of the world's audience only see cinema in cinemas. Only 5%. That means 95% of all cinema activity is seen on television, is seen on DVDs, is seen on smartphones. Surely an indication cinema's dying, it's changing, it's becoming something else. Well, Bazin in 1936 said that cinema was a mixture of the literature, the theatre, and if you're very lucky, one or two paintings. And I think that definition still holds. We do not have an image-based cinema, we have a text-based cinema. Every single film, absolutely every single film you've probably ever seen started life as a text, even if that's a scribble on the back of an envelope. So therefore, you know, it's not really, I mean, sometimes I would say we've never seen any cinema. Cinema doesn't exist. All we have is 120 years of illustrated text. Illustrated text is not the same as cinema. Cinema, you know, is a particular phenomenon which I think we understand, we dimly understand, is a mixture of media arranged in such a way as to be unreproducible by any other form. But most cinema makers, producers and directors are very lazy. They're very lazy. They're just reproducing what the bookshop does. Cinema knows it doesn't really have any content because it always goes back to the bookshop. The biggest things what in the last 15 years have been Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. We know these are books. And you can say the same for Almodovar, Godard, etc., etc., etc. Everybody makes illustrated text. That's not so surprising because certainly for, you know, right up to Impressionists, the 1860s, most painting was illustrated text. You know, it was illustrations of the Bible, Christianity, and antique subject matter, Roman and Greek. And even if you made portraits, they were normally allegories, and still lives were symbolic, metaphorical, literary phenomenon. So, you know, if it's taken 8,000 years to take away the archival literary basis of painting, it's not surprising that we have a really archaic cinema, which is still not really cinema at all. But I am very optimistic because I do think the digital revolution has pushed us forwards extraordinary with this amazing vocabulary, its immediacy, and the fact that look how cheap the material is now. You can carry it around on your back. When I first made films, you know, I needed 25 people and huge equipment. You don't need that anymore. 3 chairs. And YouTube is excellent. Okay, 90% of YouTube is rubbish, but it's still good to have a medium where me, the filmmaker, can reach my audience very, very quickly and doesn't have to go all through that labyrinthing, you know, social, political, money-making business, which has got nothing to do about cinema. It's an extra phenomenon. It's a way to earn money. It's very difficult to find anybody who's as interested and fascinated in language as I am, because I don't know what you thought about Eisenstein and Guanajuato, but it's very self-consciously about cinema, about making ways and means of expression, where the formalism which Stalin hated so much and criticized Eisenstein for, you know, is very important. Because I'm quite sure the ideal, well-wrought work of art is a really nice balance between form and content. And we tried very hard to do that, using, again, all sorts of contemporary notions of what's happening. You know, Microsoft invents something new for us every afternoon. And I think it's very important that all artists should use the technology of the present. Very few people now use celluloid, apart from maybe, I don't know, Tarantino, old-fashioned, macho filmmaker. I think that it's very important to use the tools that we have now. Certainly all the most important painters did. My favorite Dutch painter would be Vermeer, and he was using cameras. He was using camera obscuras way back in 1670. Well, I've always wanted to make a vampire movie. You know, it's a sort of genre, you know, fantastical. And, you know, it's very difficult, I think, for us to understand the sensation of evil that is part and parcel, if we understand, of Russian history. I mean, not just recent history, of course, that's relevant. Not Soviet history necessarily, which of course is relevant, but going back and back, Ivan the Terrible, you know, subject matter for Eisenstein. So I've dreamed up of this situation of such incredible evil and power and misery and melancholy, which is related, I'm sure, to frozen landscapes, but also the vast mass of the biggest country in the world, which is Russia, which is very largely empty, is related about a fantasy pact between Dracula, the devil, or vampire, all mixed up together, which is born, of course, in Transylvania, the very beginnings in the edges of the Western Russian mass, is a plot, is a relationship. There only is supposedly, following on the original tradition, vampire tradition, of one vampire at a time. And an old vampire dies, but curiously impregnates Stalin when he's a very young boy. You know, Stalin had one broken arm. That's all part of that phenomenon. He fucks him in the Black Sea when a vampire is dying on the borders of the Black Sea, and perpetuates this cycle that they make a pact which continues with the contemporary Politburo and the circumstances that exist now. And the pact is, and this is what makes the film very dangerous, and I'm sure I'll never make it, is that vampire are traditionally supposed to suck blood. My vampire doesn't. He sucks human semen, which is much more powerful. He takes it from source, and he gets the leaders, indeed, of Russia to provide him with endless amounts of soldiers from the Red Army. And that's still continuing now. So you can see how dangerous this movie would be. And the chances of making it are very unlikely. But I've developed, you know, it's got a scenario and it's plotted and so on. The script's all ready. I'm just waiting to find some money, but I know that'll never happen.